Alright, so this is going to be the first in a series of videos on the Anglo-Saxon England and the Norman Conquest from 1035 through to 1087. The course ends in 1087 with the death of William the Conqueror. It begins in 1035 with the death of this man here. This is King Canute. This is the famous image of the story of Canute where he's attempting to hold back the tide. Doesn't really matter if there's any truth in this story or not. What matters is that it demonstrates how powerful people believed King Canute was at this time. And that's certainly true. He's the king of Denmark, he's the king of Norway, and crucially in 1016 he becomes the king of England. He defeats the English king, Ethelred the Unready. That means Ethelred the Uncounselled. Again, it doesn't really matter. On defeating Ethelred, the first thing he does is he marries Ethelred's widow. This is a very important character for us. This is Emma of Normandy. She's a very powerful woman in her own right. She's also the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. She's the daughter of Richard of Normandy. What's really important about this connects the Viking, the Scandinavian world of Canute. It connects it with England, and it also connects both of these things with Normandy. And we have here this triangle of power that's going to be important throughout the whole period, throughout this entire course. We need to keep coming back to this triple area of power here. Big issue for Emma when she marries Canute is she already has two sons by Ethelred. These sons are naturally in mortal danger. So what she does is she packs them off to Normandy to be with her family in Normandy. These two sons are Edward, who is going to become, of course, Edward the Confessor later on, and his younger brother, Alfred. Also during this period of Edward and Alfred's exile and Canute in power, the other really important thing is the rise of Earl Godwin. Certainly by 1020, Earl Godwin is one of the most powerful men in England, one of the really powerful earls. He's connected, he's a brother-in-law to Canute, and there seems to have been some sort of connection between the two of them, because Godwin quickly rises to eclipse the other earls of this period. I'll come to talk a little bit about the earldoms shortly. Then we get to the start of this course, which is the death of Canute. And we have a succession crisis almost immediately. So Canute, by his first wife, has a son, Harold. This is Harold Harefoot. He also has a son by Emma, who is Hardicanute. Emma is desperate for her son, Hardicanute, to become king. Godwin initially is supporting her here. Problem for Emma is Hardicanute is currently away in Denmark. He's not on hand to take the throne. And Harold Harefoot is able to gather support, and eventually he's able to take the crown himself. Earl Godwin, in a typical Godwin fashion, as we'll see as we go through it, he switches sides at this point and goes to support Harold Harefoot, and Hardicanute is left out in the cold here. Harold Harefoot's reign is rather unspectacular. It's a short reign, it only lasts for 5 years. He dies in 1040. The most important thing for us, and it's a very, very important thing if we're going to understand what's going to happen later, occurs in 1036. At this point, it's a little unclear what exactly happens, but Edward and Alfred come back from Normandy. They sail to England. We can guess at what their motives may have been. It seems likely that with Hardicanute away in Denmark, Emma is looking to her other sons by Ethelred, who are going to come, and they're going to come and try and seize the crown here for her, for her family from Harold Harefoot. It doesn't go to plan. Edward manages to get away, but Alfred is captured, most probably by Godwin's men on the orders of Harold Harefoot, and as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle famously says, Alfred is blinded so carelessly that he dies. And this is a crucial thing to bear in mind when we go forward, that it seems almost certain that Earl Godwin is responsible for the death of Edward's brother, his little brother Alfred. We need to keep that going. Keep that in the back of your heads always, I think. So in 1040, Harold Harefoot dies, and Hardicanute comes back from Denmark. It seems likely that he was already planning an invasion, but Either way, he arrives back in 1040 and he becomes King of England. So Emma now has been the wife of 2 kings, and she is now the mother of the king. She's the mother of Hardicanute. And it's at this point that Hardicanute invites his half-brother, Edward the Confessor, Edward is of course his half-brother, to come over. I think we can imagine that Edward would have been fairly nervous at this, given what's happened to his brother, but the sources seem to suggest that Edward and Hardicanute had a reasonable relationship. They were blood relatives. And for this period, it must have been reasonably pleasant for Emma, I think, having her son as king and her other son as perhaps the king in waiting. In 1042, Hardicanute himself dies. It seems like he was drunk at a wedding. Seems to have died from excess of alcohol, the sources suggest. He dies from an excess of alcohol. So that's an interesting moral tale in itself. So this is the period 1035 through to 1042. If we just have a look, so understanding how England is at this time, there are lots of earldoms. Don't get confused when we talk about 4 earldoms. There are lots of earldoms at this period, but we need to be particularly aware of the 4 major earldoms. These are Wessex along the south. This is Ill Godwin's earldom. Mercia, which is the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, and East Anglia. These are the 4 major earldoms. And each of these areas is controlled by different, very, very powerful earls. It's really hard to overestimate how powerful they were. They're not a threat to the king in themselves. There's no attempt of any of these earls to actually kill the king and overthrow him. But these men are very, very powerful. And this is how Anglo-Saxon politics works at this time, really. It's this tension between the different earls. They work together and they work against each other. It's what we might call dynastic politics. Some of these earls play the game very, very well. Godwin is incredible at this. He really manages to secure for himself and his family an astonishing legacy, which we'll come to in more detail. So it's important to bear in mind your geography here. So if I'm talking about Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, we need to be able to place ourselves there. You'll see that Wessex is, of course, the largest of these, and it has access to the continent. It has access to Normandy. Northumbria, Mercia, particularly East Anglia, they obviously have closer links with the Danes, with the Vikings, with Scandinavia. So, some key issues to take away for when we're thinking about answering questions on this. 4 kings in 7 years, 1035 to 1042, you've got Canute, Harefoot, Hardicanute, Edward the Confessor. 4 kings in 7 years. It's a very, very rapid turnover. We've got very powerful earls vying for position. Interestingly, England survives the Viking conquest largely intact. It's testimony to the strength of the Saxon system that when Canute takes over, he maintains many of the Saxon institutions. Originally, he replaces most of the powerful magnates with Scandinavians, but these disappear. And by, perhaps as early as 1020, we've got most of these people replaced again by Anglo-Saxons. Edward spends his early life exiled in Normandy. Very important to bear this in mind. Not only is Edward the son of the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, he's the grandson of the Duke of Normandy. He lives in Normandy, he grows up in Normandy, he's a Norman, he's an Anglo-Norman. Animosity amongst the earls is very common. The earls are vying with each other for power. This is crucial backdrop. Godwin rises to become the most powerful. Emma supported Hardicanute over Harold Harefoot. This crucial point I mentioned earlier, Harefoot and Godwin are responsible for the death of Alfred Atheling. This is Edward's little brother. Keep that in your mind. They are responsible for the death of Edward's brother. Emma always seems to have supported Hardicanute over Edward. When you look at what happens after Edward becomes king, this is going to be important. That Emma certainly seems to favour her son by Canute. This little incident here, which I haven't spoken about, Hardicanute makes a deal with Magnus of Norway. So Hardicanute is king of Denmark and king of England. Magnus is king of Norway. You'll remember that Canute was king of all 3. Hardicanute reaches a deal with Magnus that states, whichever one of us is to die first, the other one shall inherit his lands. Of course, what happens when Hardicanute dies? is Edward becomes King of England. Magnus believes he has a claim to the English throne, and this is going to be important for him because he's going to invade, and this is also going to be important in 1066 and the invasion of Haut Hardrada. This legitimizes the invasion of Hardrada. Yeah, Edward returns in 1040, and him and Hardicanute seem to have been on good enough terms. So questions that come up that you need to understand this period to answer. It's rare, it's very rare for that to actually explicitly be mentioned. But it has come up. Here we've got how stable was England from 1035 until the death of Edward the Confessor in 1066. I like this question a lot because what this question allows you to do is to juxtapose the relative instability of these 4 kings in 7 years with the relative stability of Edward's reign. It gives you a really straightforward way of answering that question. You can, of course, choose to talk about instability during Edward's reign as well, but I think that this is a bit of a gift, to be honest. If you know this period, 1035 to 1042, you can really answer this question at a high level. Then we've got more of our sort of standard Edward the Confessor style questions. How far was Edward the Confessor's personality the most important cause of the problems he faced as king? Well, what we're looking at here is other problems he faces as a king. He was exiled, well, not exiled, but he was in hiding very early in his life. He grows up in Normandy. He doesn't know the way the Anglo-Saxon system works. Possibly would have spoken French as his first language. So these are important issues when we think about his problems. He's entirely dependent on his position in the early days to Earl Godwin. These are serious problems to think about. So his personality, you'd need to, when answering this question, you'd need to rank this alongside others. How important a role did the Godwin family play in the reign of Edward the Confessor? Again, think about the rise of Earl Godwin, his position right at the start here. How dependent is Edward on Godwin? And we'll look at this more in the next video, but this is really important. You need to understand Godwin is the most powerful earl in the country. What options does Edward have? Assess the effect of Norman influence during the reign of Edward the Confessor. Again, we would tend to be talking then about actually when Edward is king, of course, and I'll talk about this later, about Norman influence during his reign. But again, you would need to let the examiner know that you know about his upbringing, you know about his mother, you know that he grew up in Normandy, his mother's in Norman. These are crucial things that you need to demonstrate your understanding of. And assess the reasons for the power and influence of the Godwin family during Edward's reign. I would say this one, if we're going to assess the reasons for their power, we need to explicitly talk about the position of Godwin before Edward becomes king. You'd need to explicitly talk about this period then. So there's a lot. It's only 7 years, but there's an awful lot happens there. Hopefully this has helped. Okay?